Hey guys, Rusty Historian here, and tonight we're diving into something absolutely brutal. Why you wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. And I'm not talking about the Hollywood version with perfectly tanned extras and CGI pyramids. I'm talking about the real deal. The place where dysentery was basically a recreational activity and where your morning routine might literally kill you. So before you get too comfortable in your climate-controlled room with your filtered water and antibiotics, hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's good to know you and to feel that the work we put in is being seen. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack. Preferably something that won't give you food poisoning, unlike literally everything they ate back then. And let's jump into the nightmare that was daily life in ancient Egypt. Because here's the thing, you think you know ancient Egypt. You've seen the movies, you've been to museums, you probably think, hey, they built pyramids, they had cool gods, how hard could it be? Well, let me paint you a picture. It's 3000 BCE. You wake up on a reed mat that's about as comfortable as sleeping on a bundle of chopsticks. The sun isn't even up yet, but you're already sweating because it's 90 degrees and humid as a swamp. There's no coffee. There's no toilet paper. There's no concept of personal hygiene as you know it. And oh yeah, there's a very good chance you're going to die today. Still think you'd make it? Let's find out. All right, let's set the scene properly. You're not teleporting into the palace of Ramesses II with a team of servants and unlimited resources. No. You're getting the authentic ancient Egyptian experience, which means you're waking up as a regular person in a regular village, somewhere along the Nile around 1500 BCE. You open your eyes, and immediately 3 things hit you. First, the smell. Imagine the worst portable toilet at a music festival, then add rotting fish, animal dung, and that particular aroma of human civilization without proper sewage systems. That's your new morning fresh scent. Second, the flies. Not just a few flies. We're talking biblical plague levels of flies. They're on your face and your ears, crawling across your lips. And this isn't unusual. This is Tuesday. Third, the noise. Roosters, sure, but also dogs barking, pigs squealing, people yelling, babies crying. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of someone having what can only be described as a very unfortunate bathroom experience. Welcome to paradise, folks. You try to sit up, and immediately your back reminds you that ergonomics wouldn't be invented for another few thousand years. That reed mat you slept on? It's basically designed by someone who had a personal vendetta against human spines. But here's where it gets interesting. You look around your little mud brick house, and I use the term house very generously here. It's basically 4 walls and a roof, maybe 200 square feet if you're lucky. No windows because glass doesn't exist yet. Just some small openings that let in dust, flies, and the occasional small animal. Your furniture consists of that torture device you slept on, maybe a wooden stool if your family is doing well, and some clay pots for storage. That's it. Marie Kondo would have an aneurysm. And already, before you've even stood up, you're facing your first life-threatening challenge, the water situation. See, you're thirsty. Of course you're thirsty. You're in the desert, you've been sweating all night, and your body is screaming for hydration. But here's the fun part. There are exactly 2 water sources available to you. Option 1, the Nile River. You know, that muddy brown waterway that serves as the highway, the sewer system, the laundry, the bathing area, and the community swimming pool all at the same time. The same water where people dump their waste, where animals drink and defecate, where dead things float by on a regular basis. Option 2, well water, which is basically Nile water that's had time to ferment underground with all sorts of delightful minerals and bacteria. Neither option comes with a boil for safety warning label, because the concept of germs won't be discovered for another 3,500 years. So you're basically playing Russian roulette every time you take a sip. But you have to drink something, right? So you grab a clay pot and head toward the communal well. And this is where the social dynamics of ancient Egypt start to kick your modern sensibilities right in the gut. As you stumble toward the well with your little clay pot, squinting in the early morning light like a vampire who forgot to check the sunrise schedule, you quickly realize that ancient Egyptian society has some very specific rules about who gets to do what and when. And surprise, you're not at the top of this particular food chain. See, there's already a line at the well, and it's organized in a way that would make a medieval caste system look progressive. At the front of the line are the household servants of local officials. They get to fill their fancy decorated pots first, and they get the clearest water from the top of the well. Behind them are the craftsmen, the people who actually make things that matter, like pottery and tools and furniture. They're respectable. They're needed. They get reasonably clean water. Then there are the farmers who own their own small plots of land. They're doing okay, relatively speaking. They get moderately murky water. And then there's you. You're what the ancient Egyptians would generously call unskilled labor. You might be a day laborer, a field hand, Or if you're really unlucky, you're working on one of those famous construction projects. You know, the pyramids that everyone thinks are so cool now? Yeah, those were built by people like you, and it wasn't a spiritual experience. So you wait and wait. While you're standing there, getting progressively more dehydrated and watching the sun climb higher in the sky, let's talk about what your day is probably going to look like. Because, spoiler alert, it's not going to be fun. If you're lucky enough to be a farmer, you're looking at 12-14 hours of backbreaking labor in fields that flood annually. You'll be bent over in the blazing sun, pulling weeds, hauling water, and harvesting crops with tools that make modern gardening equipment look like space-age technology. If you're working construction, well, congratulations. You get to move multi-ton blocks of stone using ropes, wooden levers, and sheer human misery. The average life expectancy for pyramid builders was about 35 years. And that's including the lucky ones who died quickly in accidents rather than slowly from the various occupational hazards. And if you're really unfortunate, you might be assigned to the quarries. Imagine spending your days in a giant stone pit, breathing dust that turns your lungs into sandpaper, swinging heavy hammers until your hands are nothing but blisters and calluses, all while being supervised by overseers who consider worker safety to be a foreign concept. But wait, there's more. Because in ancient Egypt, your job wasn't just about making money to survive. It was tied directly to the religious and social order of the universe. The pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was literally a god on earth. And everyone below him had their place in a cosmic hierarchy that had been ordained by the gods themselves. This meant that questioning your lot in life wasn't just rebellious, it was blasphemous. You worked your terrible job in terrible conditions for terrible pay, because that's what the gods wanted. And if you didn't like it, well, the gods would probably make your next life even worse. Speaking of which, let's talk about religion, because in ancient Egypt, you couldn't escape it even if you wanted to. Finally, it's your turn at the well. You dip your clay pot into the water, trying not to think about what that brownish tinge might be, and you take your first drink of the day. Congratulations. You've just consumed enough bacteria to populate a small planet. But don't worry, you won't know that for a few hours yet. As you're choking down your breakfast beverage, you notice that everyone around you is performing various little rituals. Someone is muttering prayers to Khnum, the god of the Nile and pottery. Another person is wearing an amulet of Taweret, the hippo goddess, who protects against evil spirits. And this isn't optional weirdness. This is survival. See, in ancient Egypt, literally everything that happens to you is because of the gods. Did you wake up with a headache? You've obviously offended some deity. Is your stomach cramping from that delicious well water? Clearly, you haven't been properly respectful to the gods of digestion. Stub your toe on a rock? That's not clumsiness. That's divine punishment for some sin you committed, possibly in a previous life. This creates a fascinating psychological environment where you're constantly paranoid about invisible supernatural beings who might smite you at any moment for reasons you couldn't possibly understand. And the gods of ancient Egypt weren't the kind, forgiving types you might be familiar with from other religions. No, these were gods with the heads of animals, complex family dramas, and zero patience for human stupidity. There's Ra, the sun god, who literally travels across the sky in a boat fighting a giant serpent every single day. If he loses this fight, the world ends. No pressure. There's Sekhmet, the lion goddess of war and destruction, who once got so carried away with killing humans that the other gods had to get her drunk to make her stop. There's Sobek, the crocodile god, who expects regular sacrifices and has a tendency to eat people who don't show proper respect. And these aren't distant, abstract deities. No, they're actively involved in your daily life, judging your every move, ready to curse you if you screw up. So as you're walking back to your mud hut with your pot of questionable water, you're mentally running through all the little rituals and prayers you need to perform to keep the gods happy. Did you face the right direction when you woke up? Did you say the proper blessing before drinking? Are you wearing the correct amulets? Because if you get any of this wrong, your day is about to get a whole lot worse. And speaking of worse, let's talk about breakfast. Back in your luxurious 200 square foot palace, it's time for the most important meal of the day. And by important, I mean the meal most likely to kill you before lunch. You open up your food storage area, basically some clay pots and baskets where you keep whatever edible substances you can afford, and survey your options. If you're relatively well off, you might have some bread. Now, when I say bread, don't picture that nice, fluffy stuff you get at the grocery store. Ancient Egyptian bread was made from emmer wheat that was ground on stone, which meant it was full of sand and grit. Eating it was basically like chewing on edible sandpaper. The grinding process was so rough that by the time most Egyptians reached middle age, their teeth were worn down to nubs. Dental care consisted of either living with the pain or having someone yank the tooth out with pliers. Anesthesia was not included, but hey, at least bread had some nutritional value. Your other breakfast options were significantly worse. If you had any meat, it was probably fish from the Nile. The same Nile that we've established is basically an open sewer. This fish was dried in the sun, which helped preserve it, but also meant it was tough as leather and had a flavor that can only be described as aggressively fishy. Vegetables? Sure, if you could afford them. Onions, garlic, leeks, and beans were common. But here's the thing about ancient food storage. Refrigeration wouldn't be invented for another few thousand years. So everything you ate was either fresh, meaning it had to be consumed immediately, or preserved using methods that modern food safety inspectors would shut down in about 30 seconds. Salt was expensive, so most food preservation relied on drying, fermentation, or other techniques that left you with food that was technically edible but tasted like it had been marinating in regret. And let's talk about beer, because beer was actually safer to drink than water in ancient Egypt. The brewing process killed most of the bacteria that made water so dangerous. But ancient Egyptian beer wasn't the crisp, refreshing beverage you're thinking of. It was thick, yeasty, and had the consistency of liquid bread. It was also mildly alcoholic, which meant that most ancient Egyptians spent their entire lives in a state of mild intoxication. So there you are, chewing your way through gritty bread, tough fish, and fermented vegetables, washing it all down with chunky beer, while flies buzz around your head and the morning heat starts to build. And this is before you've even started your actual workday. But don't worry, it gets worse. Your breakfast of champions consumed, it's time to head to work. And if you thought modern workplace conditions were bad, buckle up, because ancient Egyptian employment practices would make a modern labor lawyer spontaneously combust. Let's say you're one of the lucky ones working on the pyramids. Everyone today thinks this must have been some kind of honor, right? Building eternal monuments to god kings, being part of something that would last forever. Well, here's what your pyramid building experience would actually look like. You wake up before dawn in a workers' village that makes a refugee camp look like a luxury resort. These villages house thousands of workers in cramped conditions with minimal sanitation. Imagine a college dorm, but without running water, electricity, or any concept of personal space. Your breakfast is a ration of bread, onions, and garlic. The garlic was supposed to keep you strong, though it mainly just made everyone smell terrible. You wash this down with that delicious chunky beer we discussed. Then you march to the construction site, where you'll spend the next 12-14 hours moving stones that weigh as much as modern cars, using nothing but ropes, wooden levers, and human muscle. The average pyramid block weighs about 2.5 tons. That's 5,000 pounds. And you're expected to help move these things up ramps that get steeper and more dangerous as the pyramid gets taller. There are no safety regulations, no hard hats, no workers' compensation. If you get crushed by a falling stone block, well, that's just the will of the gods. Your family gets nothing, and your replacement shows up the next day. The working conditions were so brutal that archaeologists have found mass graves of pyramid workers with clear signs of hard physical labor, broken bones that healed wrong, spinal compression from lifting heavy loads, and limbs worn down by repetitive motion. And here's the really fun part. You don't get paid in money. Money as a concept doesn't really exist yet. Instead, you get paid in rations. More bread, more beer, maybe some fish or vegetables if you're lucky. Essentially, you're working for food, and if the food runs out, you're out of luck. But wait, it gets better, because you're not just building one pyramid. The pharaohs kept building these things. Khufu's Great Pyramid took about 20 years to complete. That's 2 decades of moving 2.5-ton blocks in the desert heat. And when that pyramid was done, time to start the next one. The pharaohs treated pyramid building like a cosmic necessity. In their minds, these weren't vanity projects. They were literal gateways to the afterlife. If the pyramid wasn't perfect, the pharaoh couldn't become a god in the afterlife, which meant the entire cosmic order would collapse. So every block had to be perfect. Every angle had to be precise. Every measurement had to be exact. And if something went wrong, it wasn't the pharaoh's fault for having unrealistic expectations. It was your fault for not being good enough. The overseers carried whips and weren't shy about using them. Work too slowly, whip. Make a mistake, whip. Look tired, whip. Complain about working conditions? Oh, you'd better believe that's a whipping. And through it all, you're expected to be grateful for the opportunity to serve your god king. This isn't just a job, it's a religious calling. You're literally helping to maintain the cosmic order by breaking your back in the desert. Still think ancient Egypt sounds like a fun place to visit? Around midday, as you're dragging yet another massive stone block up yet another ramp while the sun beats down on you like an angry god, which in ancient Egyptian cosmology it literally was, you start to feel a familiar cramping in your stomach. Remember that delicious well water you drank this morning? Well, it's time to pay the piper. You raise your hand to ask for a bathroom break, and the overseer looks at you like you just asked to borrow his chariot. There are no scheduled breaks. There are no bathroom facilities. There's just the desert, and you'd better make it quick. So you rush off to find some privacy behind a sand dune, and that's when you discover one of the most unpleasant aspects of ancient Egyptian life: the complete lack of anything resembling modern sanitation. There's no toilet paper, no wet wipes, no concept of proper hygiene. You make do with sand, stones, or whatever plant matter you can find, all while trying not to pass out from dehydration and heat exhaustion. And this isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Without proper sanitation, infections spread like wildfire. Parasitic worms were so common that they were basically considered a normal part of human anatomy. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases killed more ancient Egyptians than wars, accidents, and wild animals combined. But don't worry. Ancient Egypt had medicine? Sort of. If you're sick, you can visit one of the local healers. These were the closest thing ancient Egypt had to doctors, and they had some genuinely impressive knowledge for their time. They could set broken bones, perform basic surgery, and had identified several hundred different medical conditions. The problem was their understanding of what caused those conditions. Ancient Egyptian medicine was based on the theory that illness was caused by blocked channels in the body, similar to how irrigation channels could get blocked and cause problems for crops. This wasn't entirely wrong. Blood vessels and airways can indeed get blocked, but their solutions were creative. Got a headache? Clearly there's a blockage in your head channels. The cure is to drill a hole in your skull to let the bad stuff out. And yes, they actually did this, without anesthesia, using copper tools that were about as sterile as a public restroom doorknob. Stomach problems? Time for some aggressive purging. Ancient Egyptian laxatives were so powerful that they could literally kill you. But hey, at least your channels would be unblocked. Broken bone? They actually weren't bad at setting bones, but their infection control was non-existent. Many people survived the initial injury only to die from the resulting infection. And then there were the magical cures. Ancient Egyptian medicine was as much about spiritual healing as physical healing. If you were sick, it might be because you'd been cursed by an enemy, or because you'd offended some god, or because an evil spirit had taken up residence in your body. The cure for these spiritual ailments involved elaborate rituals, magic spells, and the consumption of various substances that would probably be classified as controlled substances today. One popular cure-all was a mixture of honey, beer, and various herbs. This actually wasn't a bad idea. Honey has antibacterial properties, and alcohol can kill germs. But they also added things like ground-up animal bones, powdered precious stones, and the occasional bit of human excrement. Yes, you read that right. Ancient Egyptian medicine sometimes involved eating poop, specifically crocodile poop, because crocodiles were sacred to the god Sobek, so their excrement must have magical healing properties. And if the medicine didn't work, well, obviously you hadn't been faithful enough to the gods. Time to make more offerings and try again. But let's assume your stomach problems clear up, or at least become manageable, and you survive your morning of pyramid building. It's time for the midday break, which is when things really start to get interesting. When the sun reaches its peak, which in the Egyptian desert means hot enough to literally cook eggs on rocks, even the most sadistic overseers have to admit that continuing to work would result in dead workers, which is bad for productivity. So you get a break, sort of. You find some shade, a precious commodity that's often fought over, sit down on the hot sand and break out your midday meal. This consists of more bread, more onions, and if you're really lucky, maybe some cheese that's only slightly rancid. But here's where ancient Egyptian social dynamics get really fun, because hierarchy doesn't stop just because it's lunchtime. Even among the workers, there's a strict pecking order. Skilled craftsmen, the guys who can actually carve hieroglyphs or fit stone blocks together perfectly, get the best spots in the shade. They get first dibs on any fresh water that's available. They get to complain about their work without getting whipped. Then there are the experienced laborers, the ones who've been doing this long enough to know which end of a lever to use. They get some respect, some shade, and they're allowed to offer opinions about how to move heavy things without being told to shut up. And then there's you. As the new guy, you get the worst spot, probably in direct sunlight, because all the good shade is taken. You get the dregs of whatever food is left over. And if you try to join in the conversation, you'll be reminded very quickly that your job is to move things, not to think. But let's say you try anyway. Let's say you make the mistake of suggesting that maybe there's a more efficient way to move these massive stone blocks. Maybe you've noticed something about the ramps, or the way the ropes are rigged, or the timing of the work crews. Congratulations, you've just committed a serious social error. See, in ancient Egyptian society, innovation wasn't celebrated, it was suspicious. These construction techniques had been passed down for generations. They were blessed by the gods. They were part of the cosmic order. By suggesting changes, you're not being helpful. You're being blasphemous. You're implying that the traditional ways are wrong, which means you're implying that the gods are wrong, which means you're basically asking to be struck by lightning. The other workers will look at you like you just suggested building the pyramid upside down. The overseers will add your name to their list of troublemakers, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you'll start to worry that maybe you've cursed yourself by questioning the established order. This is the psychological environment of ancient Egypt, a society where tradition was literally sacred, where innovation was dangerous, and where questioning authority could get you killed, either by humans or by gods. But it gets worse, because ancient Egyptian social interactions were governed by a complex set of unwritten rules that you, as a time-traveling modern person, would have no way of knowing. For example, eye contact. In modern society, eye contact shows confidence and honesty. In ancient Egypt, looking directly at someone of higher social status was considered extremely rude and potentially threatening. You're supposed to keep your eyes down, speak only when spoken to, and generally act like you're grateful for the opportunity to be ignored. Personal space? Forget about it. Privacy was a luxury that only the very wealthy could afford. You're packed into communal housing, you work in crowds, you eat in groups, and you're basically never alone. The concept of individual rights didn't exist. You were part of a family, a work crew, a community, and your personal preferences were irrelevant. And let's talk about hygiene, because this is where ancient Egyptian society really starts to clash with modern sensibilities. Picture this. You're sitting there in the blazing heat, sweating through clothes that haven't been washed in weeks, surrounded by dozens of other people who are in the same condition. The smell is indescribable. It's not just body odor, though there's plenty of that. It's also the smell of unwashed clothes, rotting teeth, infected wounds, and various other bodily functions that people in ancient times just had to live with. Now, to be fair, ancient Egyptians weren't completely ignorant about hygiene. The wealthy had access to soap, made from animal fat and ash. They practiced some form of dentistry, and they even had a version of deodorant, various oils and perfumes to mask odors. But you're not wealthy. You're a construction worker living on rations. Your soap is whatever you can scrape together from leftover cooking fat and ashes from the fire. Your toothbrush is a frayed stick. Your deodorant is hoping the wind blows in the right direction. Bathing is a luxury you can't afford very often. Water is precious, privacy is non-existent, and soap is expensive. Most people bathed maybe once a week if they were lucky, using water from the Nile that was, as we've established, basically a medieval sewer system. Your clothes are made from rough linen that chafes against your skin and holds onto odors like a sponge. You might own 2 or 3 garments total, and washing them means using more precious water and soap than waiting for them to dry while you walk around in your backup outfit, which smells just as bad. And let's talk about hair care, because this is where things get really gross. Ancient Egyptians dealt with lice, fleas, and various other parasites on a constant basis. The wealthy could afford to shave their heads and wear wigs. The poor just had to live with the bugs. Hair products consisted of various animal fats and oils that were supposed to keep your hair healthy, but mainly just attracted more insects. Some people used henna to dye their hair, which helped with parasites but left you smelling like a chemical plant. Dental hygiene was primitive at best. There was no concept of brushing your teeth regularly. Most people used salt or ashes to scrub their teeth occasionally, which did remove some buildup but also wore away the enamel. By Middle Age, most ancient Egyptians had teeth that looked like broken fence posts. And then there's the question of bathroom habits. There were no public restrooms, no private bathrooms, no toilet paper. People just figured it out, usually behind whatever building or sand dune offered the most privacy. Waste disposal was equally primitive. In the cities, people might have access to communal latrines that emptied into the Nile, adding to that lovely water quality we discussed. In rural areas, you were basically on your own. The result was a society where everyone smelled terrible, everyone had dental problems, everyone had parasites, and everyone just accepted this as normal because they didn't know any alternative existed. But don't worry, your workday is only half over. The midday break is over and it's time to get back to work. The sun is now at its absolute worst, a blazing, merciless orb that turns the desert into a literal oven. The stone blocks you're moving have been sitting in this heat for hours, which means touching them is like grabbing the handle of a hot pan. But work must go on, because the pharaoh's pyramid isn't going to build itself. As you grab your rope and prepare to haul another multi-ton block up the ramp, you start to notice some concerning symptoms. Your vision is getting blurry, your head is pounding. You're so thirsty that your tongue feels like sandpaper, but the water rations were finished hours ago. Welcome to heat exhaustion, ancient Egyptian style. Modern construction sites have mandatory water breaks, cooling stations, and medical personnel on standby. Ancient Egypt they had the will of the gods and the understanding that weak workers were expendable. If you collapse from heat stroke, the overseers aren't going to call a medical team. They're going to drag you into whatever shade is available and wait to see if you recover. If you do, great, back to work. If you don't, well, there are plenty of other people who need jobs. But let's say you manage to stay conscious. You keep working, moving stones, hauling ropes, trying to ignore the fact that your body is basically cooking from the inside out. This is when the hallucinations start. Severe dehydration and heat exhaustion can cause all sorts of interesting mental effects. You might start seeing things that aren't there. You might hear voices. You might start having conversations with dead relatives. In modern times, we'd recognize these as symptoms of a medical emergency. In ancient Egypt, they were signs that the gods were trying to communicate with you. So instead of getting medical help, you might actually be encouraged to keep working while experiencing heat-induced psychosis, because obviously the gods are giving you special strength to complete your divine mission of pyramid building. And this wasn't uncommon. The combination of extreme physical labor, dehydration, malnutrition, and psychological stress created a perfect storm for mental health issues. Many ancient Egyptians lived their entire lives in what we would now recognize as states of severe depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress. But mental health wasn't understood as a medical issue. If you were sad, it was because you'd offended the gods. If you were anxious, it was because you weren't being faithful enough. If you were having nightmares, it was because evil spirits were attacking you in your sleep. The treatments for these conditions were not helpful. More prayers, more offerings to the gods, and various rituals that mainly just added to the psychological stress. Some people turned to alcohol or opium for relief, both of which were available in ancient Egypt. But addiction was seen as a moral failing rather than a medical condition, so getting help meant being ostracized from your community. As the afternoon drags on and your physical and mental state continues to deteriorate, you start to understand why the average life expectancy in ancient Egypt was somewhere around 30 years. This isn't living, it's surviving, day by day, until your body finally gives out. But the day isn't over yet. In fact, some of the worst parts are still to come. Finally, as the sun starts to sink toward the horizon, the workday comes to an end. Your body aches in places you didn't know could ache. Your hands are bloody from rope burns. Your back feels like someone's been hitting it with a sledgehammer for the past 12 hours. But hey, it's time to relax and enjoy some ancient Egyptian nightlife. Just kidding. There is no nightlife. You trudge back to your workers' village, which by now has reached peak aroma. Imagine a locker room, but if the locker room had been sitting in the desert heat for months without proper ventilation or cleaning. Your evening meal consists of surprise, more bread, more onions, and more of that chunky beer that tastes like liquid cardboard. This is your reward for a day of backbreaking labor, the exact same food you had for breakfast and lunch. But wait, there's entertainment. Sort of. Ancient Egyptians did have forms of recreation. Wealthy people played board games like Senet, which was basically ancient Egyptian chess, but with religious significance. They had music, dancing, and storytelling. But you're not wealthy. Your entertainment options are limited to 1. Sitting around complaining about work, quietly so the overseers don't hear. 2. Picking parasites out of each other's hair. 3. Listening to the same stories you've heard 1,000 times before. 4. Falling asleep from exhaustion. The stories are actually kind of interesting, in a terrifying way. Ancient Egyptian mythology is full of gods who eat each other, resurrect from the dead, and turn people into various animals as punishment for minor infractions. There's the story of Set murdering his brother Osiris, chopping him into pieces, and scattering the parts across Egypt. There's the tale of Sekhmet going on a killing spree that only ended when the other gods tricked her into drinking beer mixed with pomegranate juice, which she thought was blood. These weren't feel-good bedtime stories. They were cautionary tales about the importance of respecting divine authority and not angering beings who could destroy you on a whim. And speaking of divine authority, evening time is when you're expected to perform your daily religious obligations. This isn't optional. It's a requirement for staying in the gods' good graces. You need to say prayers to Ra for bringing the sun through another successful journey across the sky. You need to thank Khnum for the water you drank, even though it might have given you dysentery. You need to make offerings to whatever household gods your family worships. These offerings come out of your already meager resources. A piece of bread here, a cup of beer there, maybe some flowers if you can find them. It doesn't sound like much, but when you're living on subsistence rations, every piece of food you give to the gods is food that your body desperately needs. But you can't skip the religious obligations, because that would be inviting cosmic disaster. And in a world where everything from natural disasters to personal injuries is attributed to divine displeasure, you can't afford to take any chances. As darkness falls, and it falls quickly in the desert, there's no gradual twilight like you might be used to. You prepare for bed, which means going back to that reed mat that feels like it was designed by someone who had never seen a human spine. But before you can sleep, there's one more challenge to face: the night shift. You might think that once the sun goes down, your troubles are over, you're exhausted, you're in pain, and all you want to do is pass out until dawn. But ancient Egypt at night was a whole different kind of nightmare. First, there are the animals. The desert isn't empty. It's full of creatures that see humans as either food or threats. Scorpions, snakes, hyenas, and the occasional leopard all become active after dark. And your little mud brick house with its gaps and openings? That's not keeping anything out. Scorpions in particular were a constant threat. Ancient Egyptian scorpions were larger and more venomous than their modern descendants, and they loved to hide in dark, cool places during the day. Places like your bedding, your clothes, or your food storage areas. Getting stung by a scorpion wasn't just painful, it was potentially fatal. And the ancient Egyptian treatment for scorpion stings was, let's call it creative. It involved chanting spells, applying various poultices made from animal dung and herbs, and hoping the gods decided you were worth saving. Then there were the snakes. Egypt was home to several species of deadly serpents, including cobras, vipers, and the legendary asp. These creatures were both feared and worshipped. The cobra was a symbol of pharaonic power, but that didn't make them any less likely to kill you if you accidentally stepped on one in the dark. But the real terror of ancient Egyptian nights wasn't the animals you could see, it was the ones you couldn't. Ancient Egyptians believed that the night was when evil spirits, demons, and the restless dead came out to torment the living. These weren't just superstitions. To the ancient Egyptian mind, they were absolute reality. There were demons that would steal your breath while you slept, spirits that would possess your body and make you do terrible things, the ghosts of people who had died violently or hadn't been properly mummified, wandering the desert looking for revenge. And then there was Apep, the great serpent of chaos, who tried to devour Ra's solar boat every night. If Apep succeeded, the sun wouldn't rise the next morning, and the world would end. So every night was potentially the last night of existence. This created a psychological environment where going to sleep was genuinely terrifying. You'd lie there on your uncomfortable reed mat, listening to every sound, wondering if that rustling noise was just the wind or something much worse. And speaking of sounds, ancient Egypt at night was not quiet. Dogs barked constantly. Not just pet dogs, but wild dogs and jackals prowling around the villages looking for food scraps. Cats yowled as they hunted or fought. Owls hooted ominously, and owls were associated with death in Egyptian mythology. But perhaps the most disturbing nighttime sounds were human sounds. People crying out in their sleep from nightmares. Others groaning from pain or illness. The sound of someone having another bout of dysentery. Babies crying from hunger or discomfort. And occasionally you'd hear screaming. Sometimes it was someone who had been bitten or stung by something venomous. Sometimes it was a woman dying in childbirth, which happened with horrifying frequency. Sometimes it was just someone having a complete mental breakdown from the stress of trying to survive in this brutal environment. These screams would echo across the village, and everyone would lie still and pretend they hadn't heard anything, because getting involved in someone else's crisis might draw unwanted attention from both human authorities and supernatural forces. Sleep, when it finally came, was often interrupted by nightmares. The combination of physical stress, malnutrition, and psychological trauma created the perfect conditions for night terrors. People would wake up screaming, convinced that demons were attacking them or that they were being dragged into the underworld. And in the morning, if you survived the night, you'd wake up to do it all over again. Now, we've been assuming you're male for most of this hellish journey, but let's take a moment to consider what daily life would be like if you were a woman in ancient Egypt. Spoiler alert, it's somehow even worse. On the surface, ancient Egypt was actually more progressive about women's rights than many other ancient civilizations. Women could own property, initiate divorce, run businesses, and even become pharaohs, though this was extremely rare. But don't let that fool you into thinking ancient Egyptian women had it easy. Their daily reality was a special kind of nightmare that makes everything we've discussed so far look like a pleasant vacation. Let's start with the obvious. You're still doing all the same brutal physical labor as the men, but now you also get to handle what the ancient Egyptians considered women's work. This includes grinding grain into flour, using heavy stone tools that destroy your joints and cover you in gritty dust. Imagine spending hours every day crushing wheat between massive stones, breathing in flour dust that turns your lungs into sandpaper, while your hands develop calluses thick enough to stop bullets. You're also responsible for making bread, which in ancient Egypt was not the simple process you might imagine. First, you had to grind the grain, as mentioned. Then you had to mix it with water that might contain any number of delightful diseases. Then, you had to knead the dough by hand, often trampling it with your feet like grapes in a wine press. The bread was baked in clay ovens that reached temperatures hot enough to cause serious burns if you weren't careful. And careful was difficult when you were exhausted, malnourished, and working in conditions that would violate every modern workplace safety regulation. But bread making was just the beginning. You were also expected to make clothing for your entire family. This meant spinning flax into thread using primitive spinning wheels, then weaving that thread into fabric on looms that required hours of repetitive motion that destroyed your back and shoulders. The dyes used to color fabric were made from various plants and minerals that were often toxic. Many women developed skin conditions, respiratory problems, and other health issues from prolonged exposure to these chemicals. And then there was pregnancy and childbirth, which in ancient Egypt was basically Russian roulette with extra suffering. Ancient Egyptian women typically became pregnant for the first time in their early teens and continued having children throughout their reproductive years. Birth control existed, but was primitive and often ineffective. Methods included crocodile dung pessaries, yes really, and various herbal concoctions that were more likely to poison you than prevent pregnancy. Pregnancy in ancient Egypt was considered a blessing from the gods, but it was also a death sentence for a shocking number of women. Maternal mortality rates were astronomical. Somewhere around 20 to 30% of women died in childbirth or from complications shortly afterward. And the birthing process itself was medieval. There were no hospitals, no trained medical professionals, and no concept of sterile conditions. When a woman went into labor, she was attended by female relatives and maybe a midwife who had learned her skills through trial and error rather than any formal training. The birthing position was squatting on special bricks, called birth bricks, while the midwife and other women tried to help pull the baby out. Pain relief consisted of chanting prayers to Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, and maybe chewing on some herbs that might have mild analgesic properties. If something went wrong, if the baby was breached, if there were complications, if the mother started hemorrhaging, there was basically nothing anyone could do except pray and hope for divine intervention. Many women died slowly and in agony from infections that developed after difficult births. Others died from blood loss. Some died because the baby got stuck and couldn't be delivered safely. And if you survived childbirth, congratulations. Now you got to do it again in a year or two because family planning wasn't really a concept, and infant mortality was so high that having many children was the only way to ensure some of them would survive to adulthood. Speaking of infant mortality, roughly 50% of children died before their 5th birthday. This means that, as a woman, you could expect to watch half of your babies die from disease, malnutrition, accidents, or any number of other causes that modern medicine prevents easily. The psychological trauma of watching your children die repeatedly, combined with the physical trauma of constant pregnancy and childbirth, created a situation where many ancient Egyptian women lived in states of chronic grief and depression. But you couldn't show it, because that would be questioning the will of the gods. If your children died, it was because you hadn't been faithful enough, or because you'd committed some sin, or because the gods needed those children for some divine purpose. And through all of this, you were still expected to do your regular work, maintain the household, serve your husband, and participate in all the religious and social obligations that we discussed earlier. Yeah, being a woman in ancient Egypt was not exactly the empowering experience that some modern interpretations might suggest. Let's take a moment to consider what childhood was like in ancient Egypt. Because if you think the adult experience was rough, wait until you hear about the kids. First off, there's a 50-50 chance you don't make it past age 5, as we mentioned. But let's assume you're one of the lucky ones who survives infancy and early childhood. What's your reward? Getting thrown into the adult world of backbreaking labor and constant danger. Ancient Egyptian children didn't have childhoods as we understand the concept. There was no period of play, education, and gradual development. You were basically a small adult who was expected to contribute to the family's survival from the moment you could walk. By age 5 or 6, you'd be working. If your family were farmers, you'd be in the fields, chasing birds away from crops, collecting dung for fuel or carrying water. If your family were craftspeople, you'd be learning the trade through repetitive, dangerous tasks that would probably violate every modern child labor law. And if your family were construction workers, well, congratulations. You're now the youngest member of a pyramid building crew. Children working on construction sites weren't given lighter duties. They were expected to haul stones, carry tools, and assist with dangerous tasks like moving massive blocks with primitive equipment. Many children were injured or killed in construction accidents. The educational system, such as it was, existed mainly for the children of the wealthy. If you were lucky enough to attend school, your education consisted largely of memorizing religious texts, learning to write hieroglyphs, and getting beaten with sticks when you made mistakes. Ancient Egyptian teachers believed that learning only occurred through physical punishment. The phrase, "a boy's ear is on his back, and he listens when he is beaten," was literally carved into school walls. Students practiced writing on pieces of pottery or limestone because papyrus was too expensive for practice work. They spent hours copying the same religious texts over and over, and any errors resulted in immediate punishment. But most children didn't go to school. They learned whatever skills their parents could teach them while working alongside the adults. This meant that illiteracy rates were astronomical. Probably 95% of the population couldn't read or write. Speaking of literacy, the hieroglyphic system was incredibly complex. It wasn't just an alphabet. It was a combination of phonetic symbols, ideograms, and pictographs that required years of study to master. Even educated scribes made mistakes regularly. Children were also expected to participate in religious observances from a very early age. This meant long ceremonies in hot, crowded temples, fasting periods that were dangerous for growing bodies, and exposure to religious imagery that would probably traumatize modern children. Ancient Egyptian religious art included graphic depictions of death, dismemberment, divine punishment, and various forms of suffering. Children saw these images regularly and were expected to understand that this was normal and necessary for maintaining cosmic order. The psychological development of ancient Egyptian children occurred in an environment of constant fear. Fear of death, disease, divine punishment, accidents, violence, and natural disasters. They grew up assuming that life was supposed to be brutal and that suffering was the natural state of human existence. Child mortality was so high that parents often didn't name their children until they were several years old, and it demonstrated that they might actually survive. This emotional distance was a psychological survival mechanism, but it also meant that many children grew up feeling unloved and unwanted. And for girls, childhood ended even earlier than for boys, because they were expected to marry and start having children as soon as they reached puberty, often around age 12 or 13. Marriage wasn't based on love or compatibility. It was an economic arrangement designed to strengthen family alliances and ensure the survival of family bloodlines. Children had no say in who they married or when. Young girls were often married to much older men who already had wives and children. They went from being children to being wives, mothers, and domestic servants with no transition period. The trauma of early marriage, combined with the dangers of early pregnancy and childbirth, meant that many girls died before they ever had a chance to become women. Those who survived often did so by developing psychological coping mechanisms that we would now recognize as symptoms of chronic trauma: emotional numbness, hypervigilance, and the ability to dissociate from physical and emotional pain. This isn't to say that ancient Egyptian parents didn't love their children. Many tomb paintings and writings show evidence of genuine affection between parents and children. But love wasn't enough to protect children from the harsh realities of survival in one of history's most challenging environments. Let's say that somehow, miraculously, you've managed to survive your first day in ancient Egypt. You haven't died from dysentery, heat stroke, construction accidents, animal attacks, or divine punishment. You're starting to think maybe you can handle this ancient living thing after all. That's when you accidentally break one of the approximately 10,000 laws that governed every aspect of ancient Egyptian life. The ancient Egyptian legal system was based on the concept of ma'at, divine order and justice. This sounds noble until you realize that ma'at was maintained through punishments that would make modern prison reformers weep. Let's start with some basic legal principles that might surprise you. There was no presumption of innocence. If you were accused of a crime, you were probably guilty, because why else would the gods allow you to be accused? There were no lawyers. You represented yourself, which was challenging if you couldn't read or write, which, as we've established, describes about 95% of the population. There was no jury of your peers. Justice was administered by government officials who were appointed by the pharaoh and who had absolutely no incentive to show mercy to common criminals. Evidence was often obtained through torture. The ancient Egyptian legal system assumed that people wouldn't tell the truth unless they were physically compelled to do so. This applied to both defendants and witnesses. The punishments were creative. Theft was punished by cutting off the thief's hands or nose. This wasn't just painful, it was a permanent mark that identified you as a criminal for the rest of your life. Try getting a job when everyone can see your missing body parts. Adultery could result in castration for men or having your nose cut off for women. Again, these were permanent markers of shame that made it impossible to reintegrate into society. False testimony was punished by cutting out the liar's tongue. This was particularly harsh in a society where most communication was oral rather than written. And then there was the death penalty, which was used for a surprisingly wide range of offenses. Murder, obviously, treason against the pharaoh, desecrating temples or religious objects, but also theft of certain valuable items, repeated minor crimes, and sometimes just being in the wrong place at the wrong time when the authorities needed someone to blame for a problem. Executions were public spectacles designed to terrify the population into compliance. Methods included hanging, drowning, burning, being trampled by animals, and the ever-popular being buried alive in the desert. But here's where the ancient Egyptian justice system gets really interesting: the concept of collective punishment. If one member of a family committed a serious crime, the entire family could be held responsible. Children, spouses, parents, and siblings could all face punishment for crimes they didn't commit and might not have even known about. This created an environment where families were constantly monitoring and controlling each other's behavior. You couldn't just worry about your own actions. You had to make sure everyone related to you was also following every law perfectly. And there were a lot of laws. There were laws about how to address people of different social classes. Using the wrong title could be considered an insult. Laws about when and where you could work. Certain tasks were forbidden on religious holidays. Laws about what you could eat, where and say. There were laws about magical practices. Some forms of magic were legal and encouraged, while others were considered sorcery and punishable by death. The difference wasn't always clear, and the penalties for guessing wrong were severe. Religious laws were particularly complex and dangerous. Accidentally offending a god, even through ignorance, could result in both legal punishment and divine retribution. And since the gods were believed to be actively involved in daily life, almost any misfortune could be interpreted as evidence of religious wrongdoing. The enforcement of these laws was inconsistent and often arbitrary. Justice depended heavily on your social status, your relationships with local officials, and sometimes just the mood of whoever was administering the law that day. If you were wealthy or well-connected, you might be able to buy your way out of trouble with bribes or favors. If you were poor and friendless, which describes most people, you were at the mercy of a system that viewed mercy as a sign of weakness. And here's the really fun part. Ignorance of the law was never an excuse. You were expected to know and follow every legal and religious requirement, even though most people couldn't read the laws, and there was no systematic way to learn about changes or new regulations. This meant that you could wake up one morning and discover that something you'd been doing legally for years was now a capital offense, and you'd have no way of knowing until you were arrested, tried, and executed. Living in ancient Egypt meant navigating a legal minefield where any step could be your last, and where justice was determined by people who viewed your life as expendable in service of maintaining cosmic order. All right, let's assume that despite all the odds, despite the dysentery and heat stroke and construction accidents and legal system, you somehow managed to live a reasonably long life by ancient Egyptian standards. Maybe you make it to 35 or 40 before your body finally gives out from the accumulated damage of survival in the desert. Congratulations, you're dead. Surely now your troubles are over, right? Wrong. Because in ancient Egypt, death was just the beginning of a whole new set of problems. First, let's talk about what happens to your body immediately after death. If you're wealthy, you might get mummified, a process that involves removing your internal organs, drying your body with salt for 70 days, and wrapping you in expensive linens soaked in preservative resins. But you're not wealthy. You're a construction worker who spent his life moving rocks for a god king who probably never learned your name. For people like you, mummification consisted of maybe drying your body in the desert sun for a while before wrapping it in whatever cheap cloth was available. Sometimes your family couldn't even afford that, and your body would just be buried in a shallow pit in the sand. This matters because in ancient Egyptian religion, your afterlife experience depended heavily on the preservation of your physical body. If your corpse rotted away, your soul, called the Ka, would have nowhere to live and would be forced to wander the desert as a restless spirit. But even if your body was properly preserved, you still had to navigate the ancient Egyptian underworld, which was like a cosmic obstacle course designed by sadistic gods with anger management issues. First, your soul had to travel through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, which was full of demons, monsters, and other deceased souls who might try to eat you. This journey took exactly 12 hours, corresponding to the 12 hours of night when Ra's solar boat traveled through the underworld, and there were no rest stops. Along the way, you'd encounter various challenges that required specific knowledge and magical spells to overcome. These spells were written in collections like the Book of the Dead, which was basically a survival guide for dead people. But here's the problem. Books were expensive, and most people couldn't read anyway. So unless your family could afford to bury you with a copy of the Book of the Dead, and unless you'd somehow learned to read during your lifetime of manual labor, you were basically trying to navigate the afterlife without a map. If you somehow made it through the Duat without being devoured by demons, you'd arrive at the Hall of Two Truths, where your heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. This sounds simple enough, but it was actually a terrifying ordeal. Your heart was supposed to be lighter than the feather, which meant it had to be free of sin and dishonesty. If your heart was heavier than the feather, it meant you'd lived a life of crime and moral corruption. And what happened to people whose hearts were too heavy? They were immediately devoured by Emmet, a monster with the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippo. This wasn't just death, it was complete annihilation. Your soul would cease to exist, and there would be no possibility of any kind of afterlife. Now, here's where this gets really unfair. The weighing of the heart wasn't just about major crimes like murder or theft. Your heart could be weighted down by any sin, including things like lying, being disrespectful to your parents, or failing to properly worship the gods. Remember all those times you were too tired or hungry to perform the proper religious rituals? All those occasions when you complained about working conditions instead of being grateful for the opportunity to serve your divine pharaoh? All those moments when you questioned whether the gods really cared about your suffering? Yeah, those all counted as sins. And in a life as brutal as ancient Egyptian existence, it was virtually impossible to avoid sinning on a regular basis. But let's assume your heart somehow passes the test. Congratulations. You've made it to the ancient Egyptian version of heaven, called the Field of Reeds. And what do you get to do in paradise? You get to do agricultural work for eternity. That's right. The ancient Egyptian idea of eternal reward was getting to farm magical fields that produced abundant crops without the risk of flood, drought, or famine. For people who had spent their entire lives doing backbreaking agricultural labor, the promise of doing more agricultural labor, even under better conditions, probably wasn't as appealing as the priests made it sound. But at least the work in the Field of Reeds was supposed to be pleasant and fulfilling rather than exhausting and dangerous. Your crops would always grow, you'd never go hungry, and you'd be reunited with deceased family members and friends. Unless, of course, your family couldn't afford to bury you with the proper grave goods. See, the ancient Egyptians believed that you'd need tools and supplies in the afterlife, just like in regular life. Wealthy people were buried with everything they might need: furniture, jewelry, food, servants. Yes, servants were sometimes killed and buried with their masters, and magical objects to help with the journey through the underworld. Poor people got buried with whatever their families could scrape together. Maybe a few pots, some bread, and if they were lucky, a cheap amulet or two. This meant that even in the afterlife, social inequality continued. Wealthy souls arrived in the field of reeds with everything they needed to live comfortably. Poor souls showed up with nothing and had to work their way up from scratch, assuming they made it that far at all. And speaking of assumptions, all of this wonderful afterlife mythology was based on the premise that your family would continue to care for your tomb and make regular offerings to your spirit. If your descendants forgot about you or couldn't afford to maintain your grave, your soul would gradually fade away from hunger and neglect. So even death in ancient Egypt was just another form of anxiety and uncertainty, with your eternal fate depending on factors completely outside your control. Throughout this entire nightmare of ancient Egyptian daily life, there's been one constant source of misery that we've only touched on briefly: the pharaoh. Not any specific pharaoh, but the entire institution of pharaonic rule, which was basically a system designed to extract the maximum amount of labor and resources from the population in service of one person's delusions of grandeur. Let's break down exactly how the pharaoh made your life miserable, starting with the fundamental premise of Egyptian kingship. The pharaoh wasn't just a political leader, he was literally a god walking around in human form. This wasn't metaphorical or symbolic. Ancient Egyptians genuinely believed that the pharaoh was the living incarnation of Horus, the falcon god, and that he would become Ra, the sun god, after death. This meant that questioning the pharaoh's decisions wasn't just rebellion, it was blasphemy against the gods themselves. And what did this god-king choose to do with his unlimited power? Did he focus on improving living conditions for his people, developing better agriculture techniques, creating systems of justice and education? Nope, he built monuments to himself. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the one that tourists love to visit today, required the labor of approximately 20,000 workers over a period of 20 years. That's 400,000 person-years of human labor dedicated to creating a tomb for one man. Think about that for a moment. 400,000 years of human life, spent moving stones around the desert to satisfy one person's ego and religious beliefs. And this wasn't a one-time thing. Every pharaoh needed his own pyramid, his own temples, his own massive construction projects. The entire economy of ancient Egypt was organized around providing labor and materials for these vanity projects. Meanwhile, the people doing the actual work were dying from malnutrition, disease, and workplace accidents. But that was okay, because their suffering was serving a divine purpose, making sure that God King had a really impressive tomb. The resources that went into these projects were staggering. The Great Pyramid alone contains about 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing 2.5 tons on average. That's nearly 6 million tons of stone that had to be quarried, shaped, and transported, using Bronze Age technology and human muscle power. The logistics of feeding and housing the workforce were equally impressive in their wastefulness. Archaeological evidence suggests that the workers consumed massive quantities of bread, beer, onions, garlic, and radishes. Cattle were slaughtered regularly to provide meat rations. All of this food could have dramatically improved nutrition for the general population. Instead, it was concentrated on feeding people who were literally working themselves to death-building monuments to royal ego. And the pharaohs didn't just demand labor for construction projects. They also required their subjects to participate in elaborate religious ceremonies that celebrated pharaonic divinity. These ceremonies were expensive, time-consuming productions that required thousands of participants, elaborate costumes, musical instruments, and massive quantities of food and drink for offerings. Again, all of this represented resources that could have been used to improve living conditions, but were instead wasted on royal pageantry. The pharaoh's court was a massive drain on the economy. Hundreds of officials, servants, guards, and hangers-on lived in luxury, while the people who actually produced Egypt's wealth struggled to survive. These courtiers didn't contribute anything useful to society. They existed solely to make the pharaoh feel important and to help him maintain control over the population. They were basically a very expensive form of royal entertainment funded by people who could barely afford to eat. And when a pharaoh died, the wasteful spending didn't stop. The mummification process for a pharaoh was incredibly elaborate and expensive, involving rare spices, precious metals, and skilled craftsmen who spent months preparing the royal corpse for eternity. The pharaoh's burial goods were worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Gold, jewels, furniture, weapons, and even boats were buried with the dead king, resources that were literally put in the ground and never used again. But perhaps the most infuriating aspect of pharaonic rule was the way it perpetuated itself through ideology. The pharaohs didn't just demand obedience, they demanded worship. They convinced their subjects that suffering for the pharaoh was a religious duty that would be rewarded in the afterlife. This created a psychological prison where people accepted terrible living conditions because they believed that their god-king deserved their sacrifice. The worse their lives became, the more important it was to be faithful to the pharaoh, because only he could guarantee their salvation in the next world. It was a perfect system for exploitation, make people's lives so miserable that they desperately need to believe in something better, then convince them that the only path to that better existence is through absolute submission to royal authority. And it worked for thousands of years. We've talked about how the pharaohs used religion to control their subjects, but let's dig deeper into how ancient Egyptian religious beliefs made daily life even more unbearable than it already was. Ancient Egyptian religion wasn't just about worshiping gods, it was about maintaining cosmic order through human action. This sounds noble until you realize that maintaining cosmic order required ordinary people to sacrifice their health, wealth, and happiness for abstract theological concepts. Let's start with the most basic religious obligation: daily prayers and offerings. Every ancient Egyptian was expected to pray multiple times per day to various gods, depending on their occupation, family status, and current needs. These weren't quick, mumbled prayers. They were elaborate rituals that required specific words, gestures, and offerings. Getting them wrong wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Offended gods were known to curse individuals, families, and entire communities. The offerings were particularly burdensome for poor families. You were expected to give food, drink, and valuable objects to the gods on a regular basis. This meant taking bread out of your children's mouths, beer away from your table, and precious resources away from your family's survival needs. And you couldn't just offer garbage or low-quality goods. The gods demanded the best you had. If your family only had one good piece of bread, that's what had to go to the gods. If you only owned one valuable object that needed to be sacrificed when the situation called for it. This created a perverse economic system where the poorest people were expected to make the greatest sacrifices. The wealthy could afford to give lavish offerings while still maintaining their comfortable lifestyle. The poor had to choose between keeping their families fed and keeping the gods happy. And speaking of keeping the gods happy, ancient Egyptian religious calendar was packed with festivals, holy days, and special observances that required participation from everyone in the community. These weren't fun celebrations like modern holidays. They were solemn religious duties that involved fasting, ritual purification, and hours of ceremonial activities. Missing a religious festival wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was religiously dangerous. Some festivals required participants to undergo ritual purification that involved bathing in the Nile. Remember our discussion of water quality, shaving off all body hair, wearing special clothing, and abstaining from certain foods for days or weeks. Other festivals involved reenacting mythological stories about the gods. This might sound interesting until you realize that Egyptian mythology is full of violence, death, and dismemberment. Festival participants sometimes had to pretend to kill each other, dismember symbolic victims, or perform other activities that would probably traumatize modern participants. And then there were the taboos, religious prohibitions that made ordinary life even more complicated than it already was. Different gods had different dietary restrictions that applied to their worshippers. Certain foods were forbidden on specific days. Some occupations had permanent food taboos that limited what workers could eat. Sexual behavior was heavily regulated by religious law, not just adultery or rape, but things like when married couples could have relations, what positions were acceptable, and what activities were forbidden during religious periods. Even basic activities like cutting your hair or trimming your nails were governed by religious rules about timing, methods, and disposal of the cut material. Body parts were believed to retain spiritual significance even after being separated from the body. The clothing restrictions were equally burdensome. Certain colors, materials, and styles were associated with different gods and were only appropriate for specific occasions or social classes. Wearing the wrong thing could be interpreted as a religious insult. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of ancient Egyptian religion was the concept of divine punishment. Every misfortune, no matter how minor, was potentially a sign that you had offended some god. Stubbed toe? You've angered a god. Stomachache? Divine punishment? Bad harvest? You haven't been faithful enough. Child dies? You've committed some sin that requires divine justice. This created an environment of constant anxiety and guilt. People lived in fear of invisible supernatural beings who might punish them at any moment for transgressions they couldn't identify or understand. And the remedies for divine punishment were often worse than the original problems. If you were cursed by a god, you might need to undergo ritual purification that involved fasting, self-injury, or other forms of self-punishment. Some purification rituals required participants to injure themselves as proof of their sincerity. Others involved consuming disgusting or dangerous substances. The idea was that suffering demonstrated your commitment to making amends with the offended deity. The psychological impact of living under this kind of religious system was devastating. People developed chronic anxiety disorders, depression, and other mental health problems that were interpreted as further signs of divine displeasure, creating cycles of guilt and self-punishment that could last for years. And none of this actually helped with the real problems of daily life: the hunger, disease, dangerous working conditions, and social inequality that made existence so difficult. Religion just added another layer of stress and obligation to lives that were already unbearably hard. But hey, at least the pharaohs got their pyramids built. Let's talk about money, or rather the complete lack of it in your daily life as an ancient Egyptian worker. Ancient Egypt didn't have currency as we understand it. There were no coins, no paper money, no banks, no concept of wages in the modern sense. Instead, the economy operated on a barter system mixed with what was essentially government rationing. This sounds simple and maybe even quaint until you realize that it created an economic system designed to keep ordinary people trapped in poverty while funneling all the actual wealth upward to the pharaoh and his cronies. Here's how it worked. If you were a construction worker, farmer, or craftsperson, you didn't get paid money for your labor. Instead, you received rations, predetermined amounts of food, clothing, and other necessities that were calculated to keep you alive and working, but not much more. These rations were controlled by government officials who decided what you needed, when you would get it, and how much was appropriate for someone of your social status. You had no negotiating power, no ability to demand better treatment, and no alternative if you didn't like the deal. For a pyramid worker, daily rations typically included a few loaves of bread, made from that delicious sand-filled flour we discussed earlier, a ration of beer, chunky, yeasty, and mildly alcoholic, some onions and garlic, supposed to keep you strong, mainly just made you smell, occasionally some fish or meat if you were lucky. That was it. That was your entire compensation for spending 14 hours a day moving multi-ton blocks of stone in the desert heat. And here's the really insidious part. You couldn't save up these rations to buy something better. Bread goes moldy within a few days. Beer ferments and goes bad. Onions rot. Fish spoils. Everything you were given had to be consumed immediately or it became worthless. This meant you could never accumulate wealth, never improve your situation, never build up resources to start your own business or buy better tools or invest in your children's future. You were trapped in a cycle of daily survival where each day's work earned you just enough to survive that day. But it gets worse. The ration system wasn't even reliable. If the Nile didn't flood properly, crop yields would drop and everyone's rations would be reduced. If there was a war or political instability, resources would be diverted to the military and civilian rations would be cut. If the pharaoh decided to build an extra fancy tomb, more workers would be conscripted, and the remaining rations would have to be stretched further. And if you got sick or injured and couldn't work, no rations. If you were too old to keep up with the physical demands, no rations. If you complained about working conditions or questioned orders, no rations. The government officials who controlled the ration distribution were notoriously corrupt. They would skim off the best food for themselves and their families, leaving workers with moldy bread, sour beer, and rotting vegetables. But complaining about corruption was dangerous because it implied you were questioning the pharaoh's system of government. Now, there was some limited trade and bartering between individuals, but it was heavily regulated and taxed. If you wanted to trade some of your bread ration for a better tool, you had to go through official channels and pay taxes on the transaction. The tax system was particularly brutal. Egypt had taxes on property, taxes on trade, taxes on livestock, taxes on crafts, and special taxes for religious festivals and construction projects. These taxes were paid in goods and labor rather than money, which meant you might have to give up part of your already inadequate rations, or spend extra days working without compensation. And tax collection was enforced through physical violence. Tax collectors traveled with armed guards and were authorized to beat people who couldn't pay, confiscate their possessions, and even enslave family members as payment for tax debts. The wealthy, meanwhile, operated in a completely different economic system. They owned land, controlled trade networks, and had access to luxury goods from across the ancient world. They paid their taxes too, but they could afford to do so without starving. This created a two-tier economy where the rich got richer while the poor remained trapped in subsistence-level poverty. Social mobility was virtually non-existent because there was no way to accumulate the capital needed to change your circumstances, and the psychological impact of this economic system was devastating. People learned to think of themselves as expendable resources, rather than individuals with rights and opportunities. They accepted poverty as natural and inevitable because they had never seen any alternative. The government reinforced this mindset through propaganda that portrayed the pharaoh as a benevolent father figure who provided for his subjects out of divine generosity. The fact that you were starving while building his tomb wasn't exploitation. It was a gift of employment from your god king. This economic system lasted for thousands of years because it was so effective at preventing organized resistance. When people are focused on daily survival, they don't have the time, energy, or resources to organize political opposition. And when the system occasionally produced rebellions or uprisings, they were brutally crushed by military forces that were well-fed, well-equipped, and highly motivated to protect their privileged position in the economic hierarchy. Just when you think you've got the hang of surviving in ancient Egypt, you've learned to avoid the most dangerous construction tasks, you've figured out which water sources are least likely to kill you, you've memorized all the important religious rituals, nature decides to remind you who's really in charge. Ancient Egypt was at the mercy of natural forces that could destroy years of hard work in a matter of hours. And because the ancient Egyptians attributed everything to divine will, natural disasters weren't just physical catastrophes. They were signs that the gods were angry and needed to be appeased through more sacrifice and suffering. Let's start with the most fundamental natural disaster, Nile flood failure. The entire civilization of ancient Egypt depended on the annual flood of the Nile River. Every year, monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands would cause the river to overflow its banks, depositing fertile silt across the floodplains and providing the irrigation necessary for agriculture. When the flood was just right, not too high, not too low, Egypt prospered. Crops grew abundantly, people ate well, and there was surplus grain to support the massive construction projects and military campaigns that the pharaohs loved so much. But when the flood failed, when it was too low to provide adequate irrigation or too high and washed away everything in its path, the results were catastrophic. A low flood meant drought. Crops would wither and die in the fields, wells would run dry, livestock would die from thirst. And because ancient Egypt had no significant rainfall except along the Mediterranean coast, there was no backup water source. During drought years, your already inadequate food rations would be cut even further. Bread would become scarce and expensive. Beer production would halt because there wasn't enough grain. People would start dying from malnutrition and dehydration. And remember, you couldn't just relocate to somewhere with better water access. You were tied to your job, your community, and your social obligations. Leaving meant abandoning your family, your ancestors' graves, and your place in the cosmic order. A high flood was almost as bad as a low one. When the Nile rose too high, it would destroy mud brick houses, wash away stored food supplies, and drown livestock. Entire villages could be swept away in a matter of hours. The floodwaters would also stir up all the sewage, dead animals, and other contaminants that had settled to the bottom of the river, creating perfect breeding conditions for waterborne diseases. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid would spread rapidly through populations that were already weakened by the stress of losing their homes and belongings. But floods and droughts weren't the only natural disasters that could ruin your day. Ancient Egypt was prone to severe sandstorms that could last for days. These storms would bury crops, fill wells with sand, and make it impossible to work or travel. The fine sand would get into everything, your food, your clothes, your lungs, causing respiratory problems that could last for months. During sandstorms, visibility would drop to zero, making it easy to get lost even in familiar areas. People would wander in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion or suffocation. Bodies were often found days later, buried under sand dunes that had shifted during the storm. Locust swarms were another regular catastrophe. These clouds of insects could strip entire fields bare in a matter of hours, destroying months of agricultural work. And because locusts moved in unpredictable patterns, there was no way to prepare for or prevent their attacks. After a locust swarm, farmers would be left with nothing to harvest and no seed grain for the following year. This often led to multi-year famines that killed significant portions of the population. Earthquakes were less common but more devastating when they occurred. Ancient Egyptian buildings were made from mud, brick, and stone without modern engineering techniques, so they collapsed easily during seismic events. The Great Pyramid and other massive stone structures were actually more vulnerable to earthquake damage than smaller buildings because their weight and height made them unstable during ground movement. When an earthquake damaged a major construction project, workers would be blamed for not building it correctly, regardless of the actual cause. And then there were the plagues, not just human diseases, but animal diseases that could wipe out livestock herds, crop diseases that could destroy entire harvests, and insect infestations that could make life unbearable for months at a time. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of natural disaster was enormous. People developed a fatalistic worldview where they assumed that suffering was inevitable and that their only hope was to appease the gods through proper worship and sacrifice. This fatalism made people more accepting of their terrible living conditions because they assumed that life was supposed to be difficult and that complaining would only make things worse. But here's the really cruel part. When natural disasters struck, the wealthy and powerful always survived while the poor suffered the most. Rich families had stockpiled food, better built houses, and the resources to relocate if necessary. Poor families had nothing to fall back on and nowhere to go. And after each disaster, the recovery efforts always prioritized restoring the pharaoh's projects and the temples before helping ordinary people rebuild their lives. The pyramid construction would resume as soon as possible, while workers continued to live in temporary shelters and survive on reduced rations. The message was clear. The pharaoh's monuments were more important than people's lives. and the gods cared more about royal tomb construction than human suffering. This created a society where people learned to expect abandonment during their greatest times of need. They knew that when disaster struck, they would be on their own, and that their survival depended on luck rather than justice or compassion. We're nearing the end of your first and probably last day in ancient Egypt, and let's take stock of where you are physically, mentally, and spiritually. Physically, you're a mess. Your body is dehydrated, malnourished, and injured in multiple places. Your hands are raw from rope burns. Your back is screaming from lifting heavy stones. Your feet are cut and bleeding from walking on rough surfaces without proper shoes. You've consumed water that was basically a bacterial soup, food that was full of sand and grit, and beer that would probably violate modern health codes. Your digestive system is in full revolt, and you're developing the kind of cough that comes from breathing stone dust all day. Your skin is burned from sun exposure, covered in cuts and scrapes, and home to various parasites that you picked up from your unsanitary living conditions. You probably have lice, fleas, and intestinal worms, all of which are considered normal parts of human existence. Mentally, you're experiencing what we would now recognize as acute stress disorder. The combination of physical exhaustion, constant fear, social anxiety, and sensory overload has pushed your psychological coping mechanisms past their breaking point. You're having trouble concentrating, making decisions, or remembering simple tasks. Your sleep is disrupted by nightmares about angry gods, workplace accidents, and various forms of violent death. You're constantly on edge, jumping at unexpected sounds and assuming the worst about every situation. The learned helplessness that comes from having no control over your circumstances has begun to set in. You're starting to accept that this is just how life is, and that hoping for better conditions is both futile and potentially blasphemous. Spiritually, you're trapped in a system of beliefs that makes your suffering not only inevitable, but morally necessary. Every pain, every hardship, every moment of despair is either a test from the gods or punishment for your inadequate faith. You can't question this system without risking both social ostracism and divine retribution. You can't seek help without admitting weakness that might be interpreted as lack of faith. You can't even express your feelings without potentially offending supernatural beings who might make your situation worse. And as the sun sets on your first day in ancient Egypt, you realize that this isn't a temporary hardship that you need to endure until things get better. This is your life now. This is what every day will look like until your body finally gives out and your soul embarks on the equally dangerous journey through the afterlife. The average life expectancy for someone in your position was about 30 to 35 years, but that average includes people who died as children. If you made it to adulthood, you might live to 40 or 50 if you were extremely lucky and managed to avoid the diseases, accidents, violence, and natural disasters that claimed most of your contemporaries. But those extra years wouldn't be comfortable golden years of retirement. They would be decades of increasing physical disability, chronic pain, social irrelevance, and dependence on family members who were struggling with their own survival. Your death, when it came, would most likely be slow and painful. The leading causes of death in ancient Egypt were infectious diseases, malnutrition-related conditions, workplace accidents, and complications from untreated injuries. You might die from dysentery, slowly dehydrating as your digestive system shut down. You might die from a respiratory infection, drowning in your own fluids as your lungs filled with bacteria and inflammation. You might die from a construction accident, crushed by falling stones, or caught in a rope system that snapped under too much weight. Or you might just die from exhaustion, your body finally giving up after years of inadequate nutrition, excessive physical stress, and constant exposure to environmental hazards. And when you died, your family would mourn you according to ancient Egyptian customs, which involved elaborate rituals that they probably couldn't afford, and religious obligations that would add to their already overwhelming burden of survival. If they were lucky, they might be able to preserve your body well enough to give your soul a fighting chance in the afterlife. If they were unlucky, you'd be buried in a shallow grave in the desert, and your soul would join the ranks of wandering spirits who haunted the living because they hadn't been properly cared for in death. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Rusty, you've painted a pretty grim picture here, but surely there were some good aspects to ancient Egyptian life, right? Some redeeming qualities that made it all worthwhile? And you'd be absolutely right to ask that question, because I've been focusing on the negative aspects of daily life, and there were indeed some positive elements to ancient Egyptian civilization. Ancient Egypt produced incredible art, architecture, literature, and scientific discoveries. They developed sophisticated mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, and medical knowledge that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries. They created a writing system, a complex bureaucracy, and cultural traditions that lasted for over 3,000 years. Egyptian art and mythology continue to fascinate people today because of their beauty, complexity, and spiritual depth. The pyramids, temples, and tombs they built are considered among the greatest achievements in human history. But, and this is a crucial but, none of those achievements made daily life any better for ordinary people like you. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge was used primarily for construction projects and religious ceremonies that benefited the elite. The medical advances were available mainly to wealthy patients who could afford trained physicians. The art and literature celebrated gods, pharaohs, and nobles, while largely ignoring the experiences of common workers. The cultural traditions that we admire today were built on a foundation of human suffering that was considered acceptable as long as it served the greater glory of Egyptian civilization. And here's what makes this particularly tragic. Ancient Egypt had the resources and knowledge to create a much more equitable and comfortable society for everyone. They had advanced agricultural techniques, sophisticated engineering skills, and enough surplus wealth to support massive construction projects. If those resources had been used to improve living conditions for ordinary people instead of building monuments to royal ego, ancient Egypt could have been a genuinely impressive civilization in terms of human welfare as well as cultural achievement. But that's not what happened. Instead, the technological and organizational advances that made Egyptian civilization possible were used to extract more labor and resources from the population while providing minimal benefits to the people who did the actual work. The irrigation systems that made agriculture possible also made it easier to control and tax farmers. The writing system that preserved great literature also created bureaucratic records that tracked individual workers and their productivity. The religious concepts that inspired beautiful art also justified brutal working conditions and social inequality. This pattern, using technological and social advances to increase exploitation rather than reduce suffering, would be repeated throughout human history, but ancient Egypt was one of the first civilizations to perfect the technique. And that's what makes your hypothetical experience as an ancient Egyptian worker so particularly depressing. You weren't suffering because humanity didn't know any better, or because the technology didn't exist to create better conditions. You were suffering because the people in power chose to use their resources and knowledge to build pyramids instead of improving your life. Every day you spent moving stones was a day that could have been spent on developing better farming techniques, improving public health, or creating educational opportunities. But those alternatives were never seriously considered, because they wouldn't have served the pharaoh's primary goals, demonstrating divine power and ensuring personal immortality. Your suffering wasn't an unfortunate side effect of ancient Egyptian greatness. It was the deliberate foundation upon which that greatness was built. And that makes it much harder to forgive or romanticize when we look back on this period of history. The pyramids are impressive, but they are also monuments to human callousness. The temples are beautiful, but they represent resources that could have saved thousands of lives. The mummies are fascinating, but they're preserved corpses of people who lived in luxury while their subjects died from preventable diseases. So, when you visit a museum and see ancient Egyptian artifacts, or when you watch documentaries about pyramid construction, remember that behind every beautiful object and impressive structure were thousands of people like you, ordinary humans who deserved better than they got, and who died without ever experiencing the comfort, security, or dignity that their labor made possible for others. At this point in your ancient Egyptian nightmare, you might be thinking, screw this, I'm out. I'll just pack up my few belongings and head somewhere else where life might be better. And that's a reasonable thought, except for one small problem. There was nowhere to go. Ancient Egypt was surrounded by environments that were even more hostile than the Nile Valley. To the west lay the Sahara Desert, thousands of miles of sand, scorching heat, and absolutely no water. To the east was the Arabian Desert, which was equally uninhabitable. To the south were cataracts, dangerous rapids, on the Nile and territories controlled by hostile kingdoms. To the north was the Mediterranean Sea, which you had no boat to cross, and no destination even if you did. But let's say you decided to try anyway. Let's say you gathered up your few possessions and started walking north toward the Mediterranean coast, hoping to find a ship that would take you to some mythical land where life was better. First problem, travel authorization. Ancient Egypt was essentially a police state where movement was carefully controlled and monitored. You couldn't just pack up and leave without permission from local authorities, and that permission was rarely granted to ordinary workers. If you were caught traveling without proper documentation, you'd be arrested as a runaway slave or deserter and subjected to punishments that would make your current miserable existence look like a vacation. Second problem, supplies. Any journey longer than a day or two required food, water, and equipment that you simply didn't have access to. Remember, you're living on daily rations that barely keep you alive in your current situation. There's nothing left over for travel supplies. Third problem, navigation. Ancient Egypt didn't have road maps, compasses, or GPS systems. If you left the Nile Valley, you'd be navigating by landmarks and celestial observation in terrain that all looked exactly the same. Getting lost meant dying of thirst in the desert. Fourth problem, bandits. The routes leading out of Egypt were controlled by nomadic tribes and criminal groups who made their living by robbing travelers. They were much better armed, better organized, and better adapted to desert survival than you were. Even if you managed to avoid the bandits, you'd still have to deal with wild animals. The deserts around Egypt were home to lions, leopards, hyenas, and various species of venomous snakes and scorpions. These creatures were perfectly adapted to desert hunting and would see you as an easy meal. But let's say you were incredibly lucky. Let's say you made it out of Egypt alive and managed to reach some other ancient civilization, maybe Mesopotamia, or the early Greek city-states, or one of the kingdoms in what is now Syria or Turkey. What would you find there? Basically the same thing you were trying to escape from. All ancient civilizations were built on the same foundation of human exploitation. They had different gods, different architectural styles, and different languages, but they all relied on masses of poor people doing dangerous work for minimal compensation, while small elites lived in luxury. Mesopotamia had its ziggurats, step pyramids, that required the same kind of brutal construction labor as Egyptian pyramids. Early Greek city-states relied heavily on slave labor and had social systems that were just as rigid and hierarchical as Egypt's. The kingdoms of the ancient Near East were constantly at war with each other, which meant that foreign refugees were viewed with suspicion and often enslaved or killed. And as a refugee with no family connections, no local language skills, no understanding of local customs, and no valuable trade skills, you'd enter any new society at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, possibly in an even worse position than you held in Egypt. At least in Egypt, you had some minimal rights as a subject of the pharaoh. As a foreign refugee, you might have no rights at all and could be enslaved, killed, or sold without any legal recourse. So running away wasn't really a viable option for escaping your miserable circumstances. The best you could hope for was to trade one form of suffering for another, possibly worse form of suffering in an unfamiliar environment. This geographical and political reality was one of the reasons why ancient civilizations were so stable despite their brutally exploitative social systems. People couldn't escape, so they had to adapt psychologically to accept their circumstances as natural and inevitable. The concept of human rights, social mobility, or political change through collective action simply didn't exist. People were born into their social position and stayed there until they died, not because they lacked ambition or intelligence, but because the system was specifically designed to prevent any alternative. And that brings us to perhaps the most depressing realization about your ancient Egyptian experience. This wasn't a temporary historical aberration or a period of unusual hardship. This was the normal state of human existence for the vast majority of people throughout most of recorded history. The comfortable, safe, prosperous life that modern people in developed countries take for granted is actually a very recent and very unusual development in human experience. For most of our species' existence, life really has been nasty, brutish, and short, and your hypothetical day in ancient Egypt would have been considered normal rather than exceptional. All right, guys, let's step back from ancient Egypt for a moment and talk about what all this means for us today, because I think there are some important lessons here that go beyond just historical curiosity. First, let's acknowledge how incredibly lucky we are to be living in the modern world. I know it's fashionable to complain about modern life, about traffic, bills, annoying coworkers, slow internet, whatever, but compared to what we've just experienced in ancient Egypt, our problems are laughably trivial. You woke up this morning in a climate-controlled environment with clean running water, electricity, and probably more food options than an ancient Egyptian pharaoh could have imagined. You have access to medical care that would have been considered miraculous by ancient standards. You have legal rights, educational opportunities, and social mobility that didn't exist for 99% of human history. Even if you're struggling financially, even if you're dealing with serious health problems, even if you're facing major life challenges, you're still living in conditions that would be considered unimaginably luxurious by the standards of most human experience. And this isn't just about material comfort. You have psychological and intellectual freedoms that ancient Egyptians couldn't even conceptualize. You can question authority without being executed. You can choose your own career, your own relationships, your own beliefs about religion and politics. You can travel freely, express your opinions publicly, and access virtually unlimited information about the world. These freedoms aren't natural or inevitable. They were created through thousands of years of social, political, and technological progress that was built on the suffering of people like the ancient Egyptian workers we've been discussing. Every democratic right you enjoy, every labor protection you take for granted, every social safety net that protects you from destitution, all of these things exist because previous generations fought and died to create alternatives to the brutal exploitation that characterized most of human history. But here's the thing, that progress isn't permanent or guaranteed. The conditions that made ancient Egyptian exploitation possible, extreme inequality, authoritarian government, religious justification for suffering, and lack of social mobility, still exist in many parts of the world today. There are still places where people work in dangerous conditions for subsistence wages, while wealthy elites live in luxury. There are still societies where questioning authority can get you killed, where your social position is determined by birth rather than merit, where basic human needs go unmet while resources are wasted on vanity projects. And even in developed countries, many of the psychological and social dynamics we saw in ancient Egypt persist in modified forms. People still sacrifice their health and happiness to serve corporate interests that don't care about their welfare. Political and economic systems still extract wealth from ordinary people to benefit small elites. Religious and ideological systems still convince people to accept suffering as necessary or noble. The scale and severity are different, but the basic patterns of exploitation haven't disappeared. They've just become more sophisticated and less obviously brutal. So understanding what daily life was like for ordinary people in ancient Egypt isn't just an academic exercise. It's a reminder of how far we've come, how easily that progress could be lost, and how important it is to remain vigilant about protecting the rights and freedoms that previous generations died to create. It's also a reminder to be grateful for things we usually take for granted. Clean water, safe food, comfortable shelter, medical care, education, legal rights. All of these things represent victories over the kind of suffering we witnessed in ancient Egypt. And maybe most importantly, it's a reminder that individual human lives matter more than grand historical narratives or impressive monuments. The pyramids are amazing architectural achievements, but they were built through the suffering of real people who had dreams, fears, families, and hopes, just like you do. When we romanticize ancient civilizations or talk about the glory of historical periods, we're often overlooking the human cost of that glory. Behind every impressive ancient monument is a story of exploitation that we should remember and learn from rather than celebrate. Let's take a deeper dive into ancient Egyptian medicine, because what we covered earlier was just the tip of a very bloody, very unsanitary iceberg. You're probably thinking, come on, Rusty. Ancient Egypt was famous for its medical knowledge. They performed surgery, they had medical papyri. They understood anatomy better than most ancient civilizations. And you're absolutely right. Ancient Egyptian physicians were genuinely advanced for their time. They could set bones, perform cataract surgery, and even do basic brain surgery. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus contain medical knowledge that wouldn't be surpassed in some areas for over 1,000 years. But here's what the history books don't always emphasize. Being a patient in ancient Egypt was still absolutely terrifying. Let's say you're working on that pyramid construction site and a rope snaps. A massive stone block comes crashing down and crushes your leg. In modern times, you'd be rushed to a hospital, given powerful painkillers, treated by specialists with years of training, and probably make a full recovery. In ancient Egypt? Well, first they'd have to carry you back to the workers' village on a stretcher made of wooden poles and rope. No ambulance, no paramedics, no emergency medical response. Just your co-workers hauling your broken body across the desert while you scream in agony. The journey alone might kill you from shock and blood loss. If you survived the trip, you'd be taken to someone who might charitably be called a doctor. This person had learned their trade through apprenticeship and trial and error, not through formal medical education. They had some knowledge of anatomy from mummification practices, but their understanding of how the body actually worked was creative. Ancient Egyptians believed that the body contained a system of channels, called metu, that carried air, blood, mucus, and other fluids throughout the body. When these channels got blocked, you got sick. When they flowed properly, you were healthy. This wasn't entirely wrong. Blood vessels and airways do indeed carry important substances throughout the body, but their solutions for unblocking these channels were often worse than the original problems. Your broken leg would be examined without any concept of sterile procedure. The physician would poke and prod your shattered bones with unwashed hands, using tools that had been used on previous patients without any cleaning or sterilization. If you were lucky, they might give you some beer or wine to dull the pain. If you were really lucky, they might have some opium available. But anesthesia, as we understand it, didn't exist. So major medical procedures were performed on fully conscious patients who had to be held down by several strong men. The setting of your broken bone would involve manually pulling the shattered pieces back into alignment while you screamed. Then they'd splint it using wooden boards and linen bandages soaked in tree resin. The resin would harden as it dried, creating something like a primitive cast. This part of the procedure was actually pretty sophisticated for its time. Ancient Egyptian bone-setting techniques were quite advanced, and many patients did recover full use of their limbs. But then came the real danger: infection. Ancient Egyptians had no understanding of germ theory. They didn't know that invisible microorganisms could cause disease. They had some awareness that certain substances, like honey, seemed to prevent wounds from going bad, but they didn't understand why. So your freshly set leg would be treated with various poultices and ointments that might or might not help with healing. Some of these treatments were actually beneficial. Honey does have antibacterial properties, and certain herbs contain compounds that we now know have antimicrobial effects. But other treatments were actively harmful. Some physicians used animal dung as a wound dressing, believing that the heat from decomposing feces would help with healing. Others applied poultices made from rotting meat, moldy bread, or other substances that were crawling with bacteria. If your wound became infected, which happened frequently, the treatment options were limited and often dangerous. The physician might try to drain the evil spirits from your leg by making additional cuts to release pus and infected material. They might apply heated metal instruments to burn away infected tissue, a process called cauterization that was excruciatingly painful and often made the infection worse by creating additional trauma. Or they might decide that your leg was beyond saving and needed to be amputated. Ancient Egyptian amputation was performed with copper saws and knives, without anesthesia, while assistants held you down and tried to prevent you from bleeding to death. The survival rate for major amputations was probably around 20-30%, and survivors faced a lifetime of disability in a society that had no concept of accommodation for people with physical limitations. But let's say you survived your injury and recovered. Congratulations, you've now experienced ancient Egyptian trauma surgery firsthand. But don't think that's the end of your medical adventures, because everyday health problems in ancient Egypt were just as dangerous as major injuries. Got a toothache? The treatment might involve drilling into your jaw to release the bad spirits that were causing the pain. This was done with copper tools and no pain relief, and often resulted in infections that spread to your brain and killed you. Stomach problems? Time for some aggressive purging using laxatives that were so powerful they could cause dehydration and death. Ancient Egyptian physicians believed that most internal illnesses were caused by food rotting inside the body, so the solution was to flush everything out as quickly and violently as possible. Headaches, obviously caused by evil spirits in your skull. The cure was trepanation, drilling holes in your head to let the spirits escape. Amazingly, some people survived this procedure, probably because the human brain is more resilient than you'd expect, and because severe head trauma sometimes does relieve certain types of chronic pain. Skin conditions? These were often treated with applications of animal fat, plant oils, and various mineral compounds. Some of these treatments were actually helpful, but others contained toxic substances like lead or mercury that caused more problems than they solved. Mental illness was particularly poorly understood and brutally treated. Depression, anxiety, psychosis, and other psychological conditions were attributed to possession by evil spirits or punishment from angry gods. Treatments included physical restraint, beating, starvation, forced consumption of disgusting substances, and various rituals designed to drive out the offending spirits. Many people with mental health conditions were essentially tortured to death by physicians who thought they were providing medical care. Women's reproductive health was especially dangerous territory. Childbirth, as we discussed, had astronomical mortality rates. But even routine gynecological problems could be fatal when treated with ancient Egyptian medical techniques. Fertility problems were often attributed to spiritual causes and treated with magical remedies that ranged from useless to actively harmful. Contraception existed, but was primitive and often involved inserting various substances into the vagina that could cause infections or toxic reactions. And surgical procedures on reproductive organs were performed without any understanding of antiseptic technique, leading to infections that killed countless women. The psychological impact of ancient Egyptian medical care was almost as damaging as the physical effects. Imagine living in a world where getting sick meant subjecting yourself to treatments that were often more painful and dangerous than the original illness. People learned to hide their symptoms and suffer in silence rather than seek medical help, because the cure really might be worse than the disease. This led to a culture where illness was seen as shameful and where people were expected to endure pain without complaint. And remember, all of this medical care had to be paid for. Physicians expected compensation for their services, usually in the form of food, goods, or labor. So getting sick wasn't just physically and emotionally traumatic. It was also financially devastating for families who were already living on the edge of subsistence. The wealthy could afford better physicians, more expensive treatments, and higher quality medical supplies. The poor got whatever they could afford, which was often nothing at all. This created a two-tier medical system where your chances of surviving illness or injury depended as much on your social class as on the severity of your condition. Rich people recovered from conditions that killed poor people, not because they had better immune systems, but because they had better access to competent medical care. And all of this assumes that you could even find a physician when you needed one. Medical knowledge was closely guarded by professionals who had spent years learning their trade, and there weren't enough trained physicians to serve the entire population. Most people relied on family remedies, folk healers, and religious treatments that were even more dangerous and less effective than professional medical care. Village-wise, women might know which herbs helped with certain conditions, but they had no training in anatomy, surgery, or the treatment of serious injuries. So when we talk about ancient Egyptian medical achievements, we need to remember that those achievements came at the cost of enormous human suffering, and that the benefits were available mainly to the wealthy elite who could afford professional medical care. For For ordinary people like you, getting sick or injured in ancient Egypt was often a death sentence, and the medical treatments available were frequently more terrifying than the original problems. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, or should I say, the enslaved person in the construction site. We need to talk about slavery in ancient Egypt, because it's a topic that gets glossed over in a lot of popular discussions about this civilization, and it fundamentally shaped the experience we've been exploring. Here's where things get complicated, and where modern people often misunderstand ancient Egyptian society. And when we think of slavery, we tend to picture the American plantation system or Roman gladiator fights, clear distinctions between free people and enslaved people, with legal ownership and brutal treatment. Ancient Egyptian slavery was more complex and in some ways more insidious than that. First, let's talk about what slavery actually meant in ancient Egypt. The word they used was hem, which translates roughly to servant or dependent. But don't let the mild terminology fool you. These were people who were owned by other people and who had no legal rights or freedoms. But here's the twist. In ancient Egypt, the line between slavery and employment was often so blurry as to be practically non-existent. Remember how we talked about workers being paid in rations rather than money? Remember how you couldn't leave your job, couldn't negotiate better conditions, and could be punished physically for poor performance? Yeah, that's not too different from slavery. Many ancient Egyptians lived in what historians call debt bondage or economic slavery. You might technically be a free person, but if you owed money to your employer, or if your family had debts that needed to be paid off, you could be forced to work without compensation until those debts were settled. And guess what? The system was designed to make sure those debts were never fully paid off. Let's say your father borrowed grain during a bad harvest year and died before he could repay the debt. Congratulations! You've just inherited a financial obligation that might keep you and your children in bondage for generations. The interest rates on these debts were calculated to ensure that borrowers could never catch up. You'd work for years just to pay the interest, while the principal amount remained unchanged. Your children would inherit the debt, and their children after them, creating dynasties of economic slavery that lasted for centuries. But there was also traditional chattel slavery, the kind where people were literally owned as property and could be bought, sold, or traded like livestock. Most of these slaves were prisoners of war from Egypt's military campaigns. When the pharaoh's armies conquered neighboring territories, they would bring back thousands of captives who became the property of the state, temples, or wealthy individuals. These war prisoners were the lucky ones in a twisted way, because at least they had been adults with some life experience before being enslaved. The unlucky ones were children who were born into slavery and never knew any other existence. Enslaved children were raised to serve specific functions in Egyptian society. Some became domestic servants in wealthy households. Others were trained as craftsmen or agricultural workers. The most attractive ones might be selected for roles that we would now recognize as sexual slavery. And here's something that will really disturb you. Slavery in ancient Egypt was often hereditary. If your parents were enslaved, you were automatically enslaved too. Your children would be enslaved, and their children after them, for as many generations as their owners desired. This created family lines of enslaved people who served the same wealthy families for centuries, with each generation passing down not only their servitude, but also the specialized skills that made them valuable to their owners. The conditions of slavery varied depending on your owner and your function, but none of the options were good. Household slaves might have better food and living conditions than field workers, but they also had to deal with the personal whims and potential violence of their owners on a daily basis. They were on call 24 hours a day, had no privacy, and could be sexually abused without any legal recourse. Agricultural slaves worked in the fields alongside free peasants, but with even fewer rights and protections. They could be worked to death without any consequences for their owners, because they were replaceable property rather than valuable human resources. Construction slaves, and yes, many of the people building those famous pyramids were enslaved, faced the most dangerous working conditions with the least protection. If a free worker was injured on the job, his family might receive some compensation. If a slave was injured or killed, the owner just wrote it off as a business expense. Temple slaves served religious institutions and were often dedicated to specific gods from birth. This might sound like a religious calling, but it was actually a form of human sacrifice, dedicating a person's entire life to divine service without their consent and without any possibility of escape. Some temple slaves were used as prostitutes in religious ceremonies because certain Egyptian religious practices involved sacred sexuality. These people were forced to have sex with strangers as part of their religious duties, with no choice in the matter and no compensation for their services. Female slaves were particularly vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Wealthy Egyptian men often kept multiple slave women as concubines, and these women had no right to refuse sexual advances, no protection from unwanted pregnancy, and no legal recourse if they were abused. Male slaves faced different but equally horrible forms of exploitation. They might be castrated to serve as eunuch guards or administrators. They might be forced to fight as soldiers in the pharaoh's armies with the promise of freedom if they survived enough battles, a promise that was rarely kept. And here's what makes ancient Egyptian slavery particularly insidious. It was integrated into the religious and moral framework of society in a way that made it seem natural and necessary. Slavery was justified as part of the cosmic order established by the gods. Enslaved people were told that their servitude was divinely ordained and that accepting their fate with gratitude would be rewarded in the afterlife. Free Egyptians were taught that slavery was necessary for maintaining civilization and that enslaved people were actually better off than they would be if left to fend for themselves. This is the same kind of paternalistic justification that would be used by slave owners throughout history. Religious ceremonies often included prayers thanking the gods for providing enslaved workers to serve the needs of Egyptian society. Slavery wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated as a divine gift that allowed Egyptian civilization to flourish. This religious justification made it psychologically easier for people to participate in and benefit from slavery without feeling guilty about it. They could convince themselves that they were fulfilling divine will rather than exploiting other human beings. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of ancient Egyptian slavery was how it shaped the mindset of everyone in society, including people who weren't technically enslaved. When you live in a society where human beings can be owned as property, where people can be bought and sold like livestock, where entire families can be enslaved for generations, it changes how everyone thinks about human worth and dignity. Free Egyptians learned to think of themselves as valuable primarily for their usefulness to people with more power and wealth. They accepted brutal working conditions and minimal compensation because they were grateful not to be enslaved. This created a psychological environment where almost everyone was mentally enslaved, even if they weren't legally enslaved. People learned to submit to authority, to accept suffering as natural, and to be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity and comfort they were allowed to have. And this mindset persisted even among people who managed to improve their circumstances. Former slaves who gained their freedom often became slave owners themselves, perpetuating the same system that had oppressed them. The economic impact of slavery was equally devastating for free workers. When enslaved people could be forced to work for nothing more than basic survival rations, it drove down wages and working conditions for everyone else. Why would an employer pay decent wages to free workers when they could use enslaved workers for a fraction of the cost? This created a race to the bottom in terms of working conditions, where free people had to accept slave-like treatment just to compete for jobs. So when we talk about daily life in ancient Egypt, we need to understand that slavery wasn't just something that happened to other people. It was a fundamental part of the economic and social system that shaped everyone's experience. Whether you were technically free or legally enslaved, you lived in a society where human beings were treated as expendable resources, where your value was determined by your usefulness to people with power, and where your suffering was considered acceptable as long as it served the greater glory of Egyptian civilization. And that, more than anything else, is why you wouldn't have lasted a day in ancient Egypt. Not just because of the physical hardships or the dangerous working conditions, but because of the psychological and spiritual damage of living in a society that had normalized the complete dehumanization of its own people. So there you have it, folks. A day in the life of ancient Egypt that you definitely wouldn't have survived and probably wouldn't have wanted to. We've covered everything from breakfast dysentery to workplace safety violations that would make ocean inspectors have nervous breakdowns. We've talked about gods who demanded constant worship and resources you couldn't afford to give, pharaohs who treated human life as a construction material, and social systems designed to keep you trapped in misery from birth to death. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought that's both sobering and hopeful. The reason we can look back at ancient Egypt and recognize how terrible those conditions were is because we've made progress. We've created societies that value individual human welfare over monumental architecture. We've developed technologies that make life safer, more comfortable, and more fulfilling for ordinary people. That progress wasn't inevitable. It happened because people in every generation recognized that the status quo wasn't good enough and worked to create something better. The comfortable life you're living right now exists because countless people throughout history refused to accept that suffering and exploitation were natural or necessary. Ancient Egyptian workers couldn't imagine a world with labor unions, workplace safety regulations, or social security systems because those concepts didn't exist yet. But we can imagine and create even better systems because we have the benefit of their experience and our own technological capabilities. The question is, what will people 1,000 years from now think about our society? Will they look back at our time the way we look back at ancient Egypt, as a period when people accepted unnecessary suffering because they couldn't imagine better alternatives? Or will they see us as the generation that continued the long, slow work of human progress, reducing suffering, expanding opportunity, and creating systems that serve human flourishing rather than elite power? That's up to us to decide. And in making that decision, it helps to remember what life was like for people who didn't have the choices we have now. So the next time you're annoyed about traffic or frustrated with your job or irritated by some minor inconvenience in your daily life, take a moment to appreciate the fact that you're not hauling 2-ton stone blocks up a ramp in the Egyptian desert while dying of dysentery and worrying about being cursed by angry gods. Your problems are real and valid, but they're also the kind of problems that people throughout most of human history would have considered unimaginable luxuries to have, and that's something worth remembering. Thanks for joining me on this journey through ancient Egyptian misery. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical suffering, hit that like button, subscribe for more content about why the past was terrible, and let me know in the comments what other historical periods you'd like to see me examine through the lens of why you definitely wouldn't want to live there. Until next time, stay grateful for indoor plumbing, and remember, it could always be worse. You could be building pyramids.